Okay, so today I'd like to offer some reflections about the current Tory leadership battle between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, or between an ex-boarder and someone who's been to a comprehensive. What are the benefits and what are maybe some of the side effects of having someone in government who has been to boarding school? Okay. Okie dokie. So, what I'm going to talk about today is to do with boarding school. A lot of my talks are about boarding school, and I'll put a reference to this in the description below, to an article that Nick Duffell wrote, I believe it was 2014, about wounded leaders, and it comes from his book by the same name, Wounded Leaders. This is another book he wrote, Trauma, Abandonment and Privilege, about boarding school. And there's also this book here by Joy Chavrin as well, Boarding School Syndrome. So why I feel this is a very pertinent discussion is, in the UK at the moment, we have Rishi Sunak, who is currently vying for Prime Minister position with Liz Truss. And I've been doing a bit of research over the last few days into these two people. So Rishi Sunak has been the Chancellor of the Exchequer until he resigns on about the 5th of July this year. And then Boris Johnson resigned. And then the 8th of July, he put his name in for the Tory leadership party. So his background is he was born in Southampton and he was sent to prep school at, I believe, age 8. It's not clear, but he went to a boarding school called Stroud in Hampshire, which is a prep school. And then he was sent on to Winchester, and that's usually from age 13 until he graduated. And then Liz Truss, she went to a primary school up in Scotland, and then her father was a professor at Leeds University, and she went to Roundhay School. And if you read Wikipedia, she talks about really not enjoying her time at Roundhay, and it wasn't a good education. And it was a secondary school, so it wasn't a boarding school, so she was a day school pupil, so she went home at night. Now, it might seem that these two people, they're vying for this position of Prime Minister. And in the UK, we've just had Boris Johnson, he's resigned, and David Cameron, it was Theresa May for an interim period, and then there was David Cameron before him, and both of them had been to Eton. So why I feel this is important is that we don't really ask that question about, are they going to be a good leader? And again, I really recommend you read the article by Nick Duffell about wounded leaders in the Guardian. And I'm just going to say a few points. So, as an ex-boarder, Nick Duffell talks about this competent if brittle exterior. So we look on the surface. So I went to boarding school aged 11 to 18, and very much I had this competent if brittle exterior. It seemed like I was a success, but internally I was really hurting. It was only when I had a breakdown in my 20s that I started to go, and realize how that linked into boarding school. So some of the side effects of boarding school that Nick Duffell talks about is this emotional illiteracy. So at boarding school, any form of emotion, whether that be anger, sadness, tears, is very much suppressed and pushed down. And so what we get is these leaders, these people who've been to boarding school who have a real difficult connecting to their emotions. Now, I've spoken or heard stories, hundreds of people, if not thousands, who have said the similar thing about this, right, I really struggle to connect to my emotions. Or wives who've come to me saying, my partner denies it, but he's just no idea what he's feeling in any given moment. And what Nick Duffell's talking in this article is Professor Antonio Damasio's research saying that you cannot make good decisions without emotional information. So if we shut ourselves down, we don't feel anything, it's very difficult for us to make good decisions. So I think in the article, can't remember who quoted it, but they're saying this idea that in the Tory party, very rarely have they made good decisions over hundreds of years. If you look at, and a lot of the Tory party over the years have been ex-boarders. So this is what this article's saying. He's saying about they must not, this is ex-boarders, must not look unhappy, childish or foolish in any way vulnerable. He also says we then take that into adulthood as a permanent unconscious anxiety. And I think nearly every ex-boarder that I've worked with has a lot of anxiety. And I too had it. It's like we get very stressed. We can't stop. Find it very difficult to relax. So what other things about someone who's been to boarding school? They don't have a flexible brain without having good attachments. And that's Dr. Sue Gerhardt who talks about that. And a good attachment is being around your family, having that ability to be at home, like Liz Truss has. It's like, right, going home at night, having good attachment. We don't get that at boarding school. Listening on my podcast to Suzanne Zedike, it's like secure attachments is, when we see our parents. Speaking to Claudia Gold, one of the leading pediatricians, last week on my podcast, again, she says that, we need to be seeing our parents to be developing relationships, and we don't get that at boarding school. You might see them, certainly now you can use Zoom or, FaceTime, but even then you're not actually in the physical space with them. But in Rishi Sunak's time, it would have just been a phone call. And I was reading this out to a client today, this idea of James Harper. And he's talking about this idea, the payphone trap. And the idea that if you called home, everyone knew that it was a trap. It was like you were homesick. So he says here, and me, 5 years I never touched that phone. But I'd picture ours ringing in the house, my mother rushing in to answer it, me hanging up before it was too late. So another thing, which is if we have been to boarding school, had some form of trauma, then we're not able to interpret facial signals if your heart has had to shut down. And that's from Dr. Stephen Porges, who did the vagal tone. So, another thing is ex-board leaders cannot conceive of a communal solution. We've learned to do everything separately. So I really recommend you read this article. And what I find fascinating in this country is we, the general public, cannot vote for who gets into power. And I've already seen in our media that people have already started to criticize Liz Truss. I saw an interview. It was a discussion between the two of them, and the interviewer fainted. And you could see Liz Truss's concern on her face that someone had fainted. This heart-centered, she's open in her heart. And yet I could hear people in the press criticizing her, putting her down. So I realize this is maybe a bit more disjointed than a conversation I usually have. I just feel it's important for us to talk about, Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, boarding school, or someone who's been to a local secondary school. What's the difference? According to Nick Duffell, there are consequences of having people who have been away to boarding school. As I know, and the thousands of people that I've come across, it's like, yes, there are very distinct side effects that we don't realize in the public. So we think, oh, Rishi Sunak, he looks good, but how different is he going to be from Boris Johnson or David Cameron? You know, so I think it's an important discussion to have, really. So I'll put that article and I'll put links into those books as well if you want to read those books. They are fascinating. I think it's important for us to go, are we voting in, are we bringing into power these leaders who are deeply traumatized? And actually, they're not going to be taking us towards, a happy solution, or a solution which is for the best of the people. So I think it's a really important discussion to have. So, we'll see September when the votes come back to see whether the Tories voted in Rishi or Liz Truss. Be fascinating to see. So if you have any questions, please do let me know. Okay, take care.